Good morning. In this video we're looking at this idea of constructing clauses. Now if you don't know what a clause is, that's what this video is all about. So don't worry, we're going to explain everything as we go. After this video you're going to understand what a clause is, some of the features of a clause, and you should be able to identify clauses within basic sentences. So let's make a start. A clause is what we call a unit of meaning in a sentence, and it's always focused around a central action. Now that might not make sense straight away, but the idea is that in order for something to make sense, particularly in written language, it has to be a combination of certain words. Let me explain. When we write things down, all we've got for our person who's reading it to look at is the words on the page. If we were only to use a certain type of word, let's say a noun, our writing might look like this. Tree, car, John, house, happiness. Now in this case, this combination of nouns or names of things doesn't make any sense. So we need to find a different way to communicate. You'll find that the same thing happens when we try and communicate with only verbs. Run, jump, take, become, see. A sequence of different actions doesn't make sense. So really what we're going to find is it's a combination of nouns and verbs that allow us to create a sense of meaning. Keeping this in mind, the first thing we need to recognise about clauses is the fact that they are a combination of verbs and nouns. And the reason for that is so that we can create something that makes sense, a unit of meaning. This is why we use clauses, to communicate meaning in our sentences. Now, a clause isn't necessarily a sentence. It could be a single piece of information within a sentence. But basically, if it makes sense, it's a clause. There are three sections to a clause. The action, which is the central verb or the verb group being performed. The participant, which is the noun performing the action or being impacted by it. And finally, the circumstance, which is any extra details about the action, such as where it was, when it happened, how it happened, with who it happened, or why it was performed. These combinations of these three things create units of meaning. It's a combination between the verb, the noun, and any additional information. So let's see how this works. This is a really simple sentence. I cut the apple. This is a clause because, of course, this combination of words makes sense. But why does it make sense? Let's break it apart a little bit. In order to identify the clause, the first thing we need to look for is the central action. You might notice that the word that we're looking at today is cut. This is the action that the rest of the sentence is built around. Without this action, the sentence would simply say, I, the apple, which wouldn't make sense. When we look at the participant, we're talking about the person or the thing that is performing the action. In this case, I. But participants are not just the person who's performing the action, it's also the thing that's impacted by the action. And in this case, that includes the apple. Now you might notice that the apple is actually two words, and this is what we would call a noun group. We use the word participant instead of nouns because there can still be nouns in a sentence, but unless they're related to the action, they're not part of the clause. That might sound a bit confusing to start with, but it'll make sense. We can see the composition of this sentence is a participant with an action and then another participant. Let's look at the sentence in a little bit more detail. I cut the apple carefully. Notice that the word cut is still the action, so it's still highlighted in green, and the participants are still the same, I and the apple. We've added an extra word to our sentence this time, and it's the word carefully. In this case, this word carefully describes how we performed the action, because yes, we did cut something, but the way that we did it was carefully. This is what we would call the circumstance. The composition of this sentence, therefore, is a participant, an action, a participant, and a circumstance that describes how the action happened. To summarise what we've achieved so far, we can see that a central action usually associates itself with a clause. Therefore, if there is one action present in a sentence, there is likely to be a single clause. When we looked at our first sentence, I cut the apple, we could see that there was only one verb present, which was the word cut. This means that this sentence contained one clause. Similarly, when we added information to this sentence and had I cut the apple carefully, even though the sentence is longer, there's still only one central action, which is still the word cut. So therefore, we have a single clause. But what happens when the sentence becomes a little bit more complicated? For our next example, we're going to use a more complex sentence, which is, I cut the apple in half and gave a piece to my sister. Now you might notice that not only is this sentence longer, but it actually contains more than one action. We can recognize the first action we've already talked about, which was the word cut. However, if we read along the sentence carefully, you might notice a next verb, and that is the word gave. Because we have two actions in this sentence, that means we must have two clauses. That really means that we have two pieces of information in a single sentence, making the sentence more complex. This is not an uncommon thing. In fact, in written language, we often find multiple clauses within sentences, and this usually attributes to what we call the density of language. But we'll talk about that more a little bit later on. The participants around the action of cut are still the same as they were. I is the name of the participant who is performing the action, and the apple is the name of the participant who is being affected in the action. When we look at the next action, I wonder if we can spot the next participants. Gave. What was the thing that we gave? In this case, the name of that thing was a piece. And who was the noun that was affected by that action? In this case, my sister. So we can notice that with each action, there has to be a participant relationship. If not, then it is not a clause. You should notice another couple of words in here which have changed slightly, and that's the words in half. Now, what does in half actually describe? Well, it tells us how the action of cutting is to be performed, which means it must be circumstance. Here we can see how a more complex sentence works. Let's look at a few variations of sentences and see if we can figure out some of the elements of a clause. As mentioned, we want you to be able to identify these in a piece of writing. Look at this sentence. In 1914, the First World War began. In order to identify clauses, you need to start by identifying the action or the verb. A good way to do this, and a very simple way, is to look at each word individually. We know that a verb or an action is a doing word, so we ask ourselves, can you in something? You cannot. Can you 1914 something? No, you can't. Can you the something? No. Can you first something? No. Can you world something? No. Can you war something? No. Can you began something, or can you have begun something? And the answer to that is yes. This means that began must be our verb. So let's look at the other features here. Because we can't see any other verbs, there must only be one clause in this sentence. What is the name of the thing that began? In this case, the name is the First World War, and that becomes the participant. So what about this other section on the side here, in 1914? What does that describe? Well, in this case, it describes when the action took place, which means it's a circumstance. Here we can see a simple sentence where the structure has been moved around. But again, in order for it all to make sense, we need to have that combination of elements. Let's look at this sentence. Once again, we're adding more words and we're going to follow the same process. So of course, we start by looking for the verb present. So again, we can say we can't the something, we can't old something, we can't man something. We can carefully do something, but in this case, what we're really talking about is the word sat. Now you'll notice that in this case, the action is actually described by more than one word. This is what we call a verb group, but this is one of the reasons why we say the action instead of the verb, because sometimes the action can involve more than one word. In this case, carefully sat on describes the thing that is being performed or the action. If we then look at the next elements, we ask ourselves who is carefully sitting, and in this case it's the old man. Notice how all three words, the old man, become the participant. This is a noun group. What's being affected by the action? Well, in this case, it's the antique bench. And once again, we've got three different words that make up our noun. We're left with our last section of this sentence, because he was tired. Is this a new clause? I don't think so. I think that this actually describes why this action is being performed. And we might remember that anything to do with why becomes a circumstance. Because there's only one action present in this sentence, there must be only one clause. The final sentence that we're going to look at today is a more complex sentence in comparison to the last two. It reads, sift the flour into the bowl and add a large teaspoon of sugar from the pantry. As we can see, our sentences are getting longer and longer, but we're still following the same process. The first thing we need to do is to look once again for the actions. You should be getting fairly good at this by now, and remember, if you're having trouble, ask yourself, can you something? For example, can you sift something? The answer to that is yes. So therefore, we highlight that in green as our action. If we have a bit of a look through the rest, you should be able to find another verb. You might choose to pause this video while you're looking for it, but to allay any suspicion, the word is add. In this case, we're doing two separate actions. So guess how many clauses there's going to be in this sentence? Yep, that's right, 2. So, let's break this up into the different pieces. Looking at sift, what is the item or the name of the item that is being sifted? In this case, it's the flour. When we look at the next one, add, what is the thing that is being added? Now this is where we get a little bit complicated, because actually the name of the thing we're adding is quite long. A large teaspoon of sugar from the pantry is in fact a noun group. So all of those words work together to form the participant for this sentence. You might notice in some sentences the participant can be quite long, and even though there are some verbs present in this section, it doesn't relate to the central action. This can be a bit tricky to get the hang of, and you'll find with practice you start to feel a little bit better about this kind of thing. But just to begin with, get used to the idea of trying to recognize noun groups in relationship to the central action. Our last piece of information in this sentence is the words into the bowl. What do you think this comes under? You've probably already guessed, but into the bowl describes how the action of sifting is going to be performed, and that means it's a circumstance. Once again, we can see a combination of actions, participants, and circumstances, but in this case, we have two clauses within one sentence, which makes this sentence more complex. Hopefully, this guide has given you an idea about what a clause is, what the elements of a clause are, how to count how many clauses there are in a sentence, and some of the ways that you can identify the different elements. This is a really important skill to develop, and you'll find that in future lessons and videos, you will put this skill to great use. For now, practice looking at different sentences and underlining the actions, participants, and circumstances that are present in those sentences. If you can get really good at counting clauses, you'll find that your writing begins to improve very quickly.